The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Margaret Chen's face as she stood frozen in the corridor, her perfectly manicured hand gripping a coffee cup so tightly the cardboard buckled. She had built an empire on calculated decisions, on reading people in boardrooms and predicting market trends. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in her 30 years of business had prepared her for what she'd just discovered about the exhausted man in the worn work boots who'd accidentally bumped into her at the elevator 20 minutes ago. Margaret hadn't meant to follow him. The collision had been brief, apologetic on his part, dismissive on hers. She'd been too preoccupied with the quarterly reports on her phone to even look up properly. But when his wallet had fallen from his pocket, scattering its meager contents across the hospital floor, something made her bend down to help. Among the receipts and a few crumpled bills, she'd spotted a photograph. A little girl with a breathing tube, her smile radiant despite the medical equipment surrounding her. The image had lodged itself in Margaret's chest like a splinter. Now, standing outside the pediatric ICU where she'd watched him disappear, Margaret questioned every assumption she'd made about success, about value, about what truly mattered in life. His name was David Morrison, though Margaret wouldn't learn that until later. At 34, he looked a decade older, his face carved with worry lines that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible choices. He worked 2 jobs, stocking shelves, at a warehouse from midnight to 8 in the morning, then bussing tables at a diner until 4 in the afternoon. Between shifts, he slept in his car for 90 minutes in the hospital parking lot, then spent every remaining moment at his daughter's bedside. Margaret had followed at a distance, initially telling herself she just wanted to return the wallet properly. But curiosity had morphed into something else as she watched him interact with the nurses, his tired face transforming with genuine warmth as he thanked them by name. She'd observed from the hallway as he entered room 347, and the way his entire body had seemed to exhale in relief at the sight of the small figure in the bed. The little girl was named Sophie. She was 7 years old and she was dying. Margaret had learned this from the hushed conversation between 2 nurses at their station. Sophie had been born with a rare congenital heart defect, had undergone 3 surgeries before her 5th birthday, and now needed a transplant that her father's insurance wouldn't fully cover. The copays, the experimental medications, the specialist consultations. It had drained every penny David had ever saved and more. He'd sold his house, moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, then eventually into his 15-year-old Honda Civic, when even rent became impossible to afford. Standing in that sterile corridor, Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd spent the morning screaming at her executive team about a 3% dip in profit margins. She'd threatened to fire her assistant for bringing her the wrong coffee order. She'd been calculating how to slash healthcare benefits to boost the bottom line for her shareholders meeting next month. The wallet felt heavy in her hand, heavier than any object should feel. Margaret watched through the window as David sat beside Sophie's bed, reading to her from a library book so worn the pages were falling out. The little girl's laugh was silent behind the glass, but Margaret could see the joy in her eyes, the way she reached up to touch her father's face with a tenderness that transcended words. David was crying as he read, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. But his voice, Margaret could tell, remained steady for his daughter. He was performing strength, sacrificing his own collapse to hold space for hers. "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't stand here." A nurse approached Margaret gently. "Are you family?" "No, Margaret looked down at the wallet, then back at the scene before her. "I need to return something." The nurse's expression softened with recognition. "You're Margaret Chen from Chen Industries." It wasn't a question. Margaret's face had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. "Mr. Morrison works in one of your warehouses, the night shift at the distribution center off Highway 9. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. David worked for her. This man who was holding his world together with duct tape and determination, who was literally killing himself to pay for his daughter's medical care, was one of her employees. She'd approved the healthcare package he was desperately trying to navigate. She'd signed off on the wage structure that made his second job necessary. She'd created the system that was crushing him. "How long?" Margaret's voice came out hoarse. "He's been here 6 months. Sophie's been admitted 4 times during that period. He's never missed a shift, not once. Comes straight from here to work, then back again." The nurse shook her head. "I've been doing this 20 years, and I've never seen anyone fight like he does. But he's barely holding on. The stress is destroying him. Last week he collapsed during a shift here, just exhaustion and malnutrition. Refused to be admitted. Said he couldn't afford to miss work or be away from Sophie." Margaret's carefully constructed world was crumbling. She'd built her company from nothing, clawed her way up from a working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, told herself that success meant making hard choices. She'd convinced herself that maximizing profit was the same as being a good leader. She'd measured her worth in stock prices and market share, and somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that every employee ID number represented a human being with a story like David's. She couldn't stop staring at Sophie. The little girl had fallen asleep, her small hand still clutching her father's finger. David sat perfectly still, afraid to disturb her, his own head beginning to nod with exhaustion. On the table beside the bed, Margaret could see a stack of medical bills, each stamped with angry red letters. Overdue, final notice, collections. What happens if they can't pay? Margaret already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it said aloud. The nurse's silence was answer enough. Then quietly, "The transplant list is prioritized partially by ability to afford post-operative care. Without proof of payment ability, Sophie moves down the list. And with her condition deteriorating." She didn't finish the sentence. Margaret thought about her penthouse apartment overlooking the bay, the one she'd been in maybe 40 nights last year. She thought about her car collection, the vacation home in Aspen she'd visited once, the designer clothes she wore once and forgot about. She thought about the $16 million bonus she'd just negotiated for herself, while simultaneously arguing that her warehouse workers couldn't afford a $2 hourly raise. The shame was suffocating. How much? Margaret's mind was already calculating, already restructuring. "Excuse me? How much does Sophie need? For the transplant, for the medications, for everything?" The nurse looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Please." Margaret's voice cracked and she realized she was crying. When was the last time she'd cried? At her mother's funeral, maybe. 8 years ago. "I need to know." The nurse hesitated, then pulled out a chart. "With the transplant, post-operative care, medications for the next 5 years, physical therapy and psychological support, we're looking at around $847,000. His insurance covers about 40% after deductibles. He needs $10,000 he doesn't have. $500,000. Margaret spent more than that remodeling her office last year. She walked to room 347 and knocked softly. David startled awake, immediately checking Sophie to ensure she hadn't been disturbed. When he saw Margaret in her expensive suit and heels, confusion crossed his face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Margaret said, stepping inside. Her voice felt foreign to her, stripped of its usual authority. "You dropped this?" She held out the wallet. Recognition flickered in David's eyes. "The elevator." "Thank you, He noticed her tears and stopped. "Are you okay?" The question shattered something in Margaret. This man, sitting beside his dying daughter, surrounded by unpayable bills, working himself to death on poverty wages, was asking if she was okay. "No," Margaret whispered. "I'm really not." She looked at Sophie's sleeping face, so peaceful despite everything. "Your daughter is beautiful." David's expression transformed, love radiating from every exhausted line of his face. "She's everything. She's my whole world. She has her mother's laugh. Sarah died when Sophie was 2. Car accident. Sophie's all I have left of her." His voice broke. "I can't lose her too. I won't. I'll work every hour there is, sell everything I own, You work at my warehouse." Margaret interrupted gently. David's face went pale. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Ms. Chen, I didn't realize— I'm sorry. I can explain the absence last week. I filled out all the forms. I have a doctor's note. Please sit down. Margaret felt sick. He was terrified of her, terrified that his exhaustion, his literal collapse from trying to keep his daughter alive, would cost him his job. "You're not in trouble, I promise." David sat slowly, protectively positioning himself between Margaret and Sophie's bed. Margaret pulled up a chair, ignoring the expensive fabric of her suit as she sat in the cramped hospital room. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." She took a deep breath. "I've been a CEO for 12 years. I thought I was good at it. I thought making money for shareholders, growing the company, maximizing profits, I thought that's what leadership meant. I told myself that business was separate from emotions, that hard choices were necessary, that I couldn't be responsible for everyone's personal problems." She looked at Sophie, then back at David. "I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. Ms. Chen, I don't understand. Sophie's medical expenses will be paid in full. The transplant, the medications, everything. And you're going to take a paid leave of absence to be with her, through the surgery and recovery. 3 months, maybe 6, however long you both need." David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I'm restructuring the entire healthcare program at Chen Industries. Better coverage, lower deductibles, emergency hardship funds. It should have been done years ago." Margaret's voice gained strength as she spoke. "I'm implementing a living wage policy across all positions. I'm creating an emergency assistance program for employees facing medical crises. And I'm going to personally audit every single policy. We have to make sure no one else falls through the cracks the way you have." "I don't... Why?" David's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret looked at Sophie again, at this little girl who'd had no choice in her circumstances, who'd been dealt an impossible hand, and was playing it with more grace than Margaret had ever shown with all her advantages. "Because I forgot something crucial," Margaret said. "I forgot that every decision I make affects real people. People with families, with struggles, with children who need them. I got so focused on numbers that I stopped seeing humans." She wiped her eyes. "Because I watched you collapse in that hospital lobby. Because I followed you to this room and saw more courage in 5 minutes than I've shown in my entire career. Because your daughter deserves every chance at life, and you deserve not to destroy yourself trying to give it to her." David was crying now, great heaving sobs that he tried to muffle in his hands. "I don't know how to... I can't possibly... You don't have to do anything except be Sophie's father. That's enough. That's more than enough." Margaret stood, then paused. "Actually, there is one thing." David looked up, hope and fear warring in his expression. "When Sophie recovers, and she will recover, I'd like you to help me. I want to create an employee advisory board made up of people from every level of the company. I need voices like yours helping make decisions, keeping me honest, making sure I never forget again what really matters." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Jennifer, it's Margaret. I need you to wire $600,000 to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. Patient name Sophie Morrison, room 347, call their billing department and get the account details. I want it done in the next hour." She paused. "No, it's not a publicity stunt. It's personal. And Jennifer, clear my schedule for the next 2 days. I have work to do." When she hung up, David was staring at her like she'd descended from another planet. "Why are you doing this?" he asked again. "You don't even know us." Margaret thought about all the years she'd spent building walls, protecting herself, calculating every move. She thought about the emptiness of her penthouse, the hollow victories of quarterly earnings calls, the way she'd confused success with significance. "Because a very wise man once showed me what real strength looks like," she said softly. "And because your daughter's smile reminded me of why any of this matters in the first place." She moved toward the door, then turned back. "Thank you, David, for being exactly who you are, for teaching me what I should have learned a long time ago." 3 months later, Sophie received her new heart. The surgery was successful. David was there when she woke up, and for the first time in years, he wasn't calculating how many hours until his next shift, or how much debt the day had accumulated. He was just a father, present for his daughter, watching her breathe easier than she ever had before. Margaret visited them often during the recovery. She brought books for Sophie, And coffee for David. She sat with them during the scary moments and celebrated the victories. She learned Sophie's favorite color was purple and that she wanted to be a veterinarian. When she grew up, she learned that David was a gifted artist who'd given up painting years ago because he couldn't afford the supplies. She learned what it felt like to be part of something bigger than profit margins and stock prices. The changes at Chen Industries didn't happen overnight, but they happened. Healthcare coverage improved. Wages increased. The Employee Advisory Board became one of the company's most valuable assets. Some shareholders complained. A few board members resigned. Margaret's year-end bonus was half what it had been. She'd never been prouder of anything in her life. On the one-year anniversary of Sophie's transplant, David brought his daughter to Chen Industries headquarters for the first time. Sophie, now 8 and healthier than she'd ever been, stood in the lobby with wide eyes, taking in the gleaming building. "Is this where you work now, Daddy?" she asked. David smiled, glancing at Margaret, who stood nearby. "Sometimes, when Ms. Chen needs advice on how to be a better boss." Sophie looked at Margaret seriously. "My daddy says you saved my life." Margaret knelt down to Sophie's level, her expensive suit forgotten. "No, sweetheart, your daddy did that. His love saved your life. I just finally learned to do my job the way I should have been doing it all along." Sophie considered this, then threw her arms around Margaret's neck in an impulsive hug. "Thank you anyway," she whispered. Margaret closed her eyes, holding this miracle child, this living reminder of what happens when we choose humanity over profit, connection over isolation, love over indifference. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, successful by every conventional measure, but bankrupt in the ways that mattered most. That woman would have stepped over David in the hallway, would have handed the wallet to a nurse and walked away, would have never looked beyond the inconvenience to see the person. That woman had been powerful but empty, rich but impoverished, successful but failing at the most fundamental task of being human. "Thank you," Margaret whispered back, though Sophie couldn't possibly understand that she was thanking the girl for the gift of transformation, for the chance to become someone she could finally respect when she looked in the mirror. Later, as Margaret watched David and Sophie leave hand in hand, already arguing cheerfully about what to have for dinner, she thought about destiny and chance. She thought about one dropped wallet, one moment of curiosity, one decision to look beyond her own world into someone else's reality. She thought about how easy it would have been to miss it all, to stay encased in her bubble of privilege and profit, to never learn that the true measure of success isn't what you accumulate but what you give away. Not how high you climb, but who you help rise beside you. The hospital had taught her what all her business degrees never could, that leadership without empathy is just authority, that success without compassion is just greed, and that sometimes the greatest power we have is simply choosing to see each other's humanity and responding with our own. Margaret returned to her office and looked at the photo now framed on her desk. Sophie smiling, healthy and whole, with David beside her and Margaret in the frame too, all three of them laughing at something Sophie had said. It sat next to her awards and accolades, but it was the only one that made her proud. She'd built an empire, yes, but that day in the hospital corridor, watching a father love his daughter with everything he had, she'd finally learned what it meant to be truly successful.